If we in any way want to do better or do history better, we have to be courageous.
That's why it's essential that we acknowledge the people upon whose backs this country was founded.
The more people understand someone else's perspective, the more likely they are to listen.
We're going to make a better future for ourselves. We need to.
I hope that in 30 or 40 years that conversations like this will not be necessary. I hope in 30 or 40 years we will look at each other and see each other as Americans.
I think that once people really know the history, I think then people will begin to have respect for one another.
This is not just Black history. This is America's story.
Located in the heart of Virginia's colonial capital is a site where they're digging to uncover a fuller story of life here in Williamsburg during the foundation of our country. But what's been found beneath the soil is a true American story about the resilience of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Sometimes when you stop and you have a moment to think about it, it takes your breath away because it is so much larger.
Off Nassau Street, just steps away from picturesque Duke of Gloucester Street, is an archaeological dig for First Baptist Church, one of the oldest Black churches in the country.
When you think about the fact that, Thomas Jefferson had not even drafted the bill in Virginia for religious freedom, and there were these Black people, free and enslaved, in 1776, 10 years before that, exercising their right to worship the way that they wanted to.
It's a congregation that Connie Matthews Harshaw belongs to today, and a story they've worked years to tell.
It's a complete story, because half the story is the untold story. And right now we've got to do a better job at integrating our history, because it's American history. It's not Black history or white history, it's American history.
An American story that began in the backdrop of the American Revolutionary War. Those enslaved and free gathered throughout the Williamsburg area to celebrate their Baptist faith, despite English strict rules for the Anglican Church. After years of moving around, they settled here in the early 1800s and would eventually outlast the crown and the shackles of slavery.
Religion has been paramount. The spirituality of our ancestors, that's all they had to lean on. When they would sing their songs and worship God in their own way in the brush harbors and places like that, it gave them split moments of transcendence to give them the strength to carry on, even when they saw no liberation or freedom on the horizon.
Reginald Davis is the pastor at First Baptist and leads their services virtually due to COVID-19. But before they were virtual, they were in this church, and before this, they were located at the Nassau Street dig site.
It was a parking lot, yeah, up to mid last year. Matter of fact, about this time last year, we were ripping it. Yeah, August of last year, we were ripping up the parking lot. Once we realized that the foundations were still intact underground, we tore the parking lot up, and we made the decision immediately. The parking lot goes, and it never comes back.
The crews have been working here for 2 years, digging and searching through history. In 1954, Colonial Williamsburg bought the church, and the congregation moved to their current location in 1956. Their Nassau Street Church had been there since the 1850s, but before then, another building here had served as their sanctuary, which crews found.
Well, we are standing at the site of the first church building that we just discovered through the archaeological excavations here. So we're looking at the foundation, the small brick foundation. We've been able to date to the early 1800s, so the first quarter of the 19th century, when the documents show us that the church is first starting to meet here. The artifacts now give us the evidence to say that this is the building that was here at that time. So we're able to say that this is the remains of the church's first permanent structure.
Director of Archaeology Jack Gary says what they're doing here can help them learn more about what actually went on in Colonial Williamsburg.
One thing we often refer to are numbers, and those numbers are that in the 18th century, the population of Williamsburg was 52% black. And if we're not telling 52% of the story, we're not getting even close to telling the full story. So I think, so we want to be able to include everybody that's part of this historical narrative of town.
The site is just one important thread of the whole tapestry that makes up Colonial Williamsburg. It's a reminder of the lost stories being brought to light.
For this project in particular, for First Baptist Church, we have a real opportunity to tell a nationally significant story, the story of one of the oldest Black Baptist churches in the country. And I think we have to understand the courage that it took for these people to worship at that time period and to congregate together when they were under so much scrutiny. Free and enslaved blacks in particular were under so much scrutiny. To be coming together and defying perhaps their masters, defying the Church of England and coming together to worship, and yet they succeeded all the way to today, and they exist today. What a powerful story. I mean, that is the American story. So we have to tell that, and our visitors want to hear that. I think it's our obligation to tell the full story.
But that hasn't always been the case. Beth Kelly, who's a Colonial Williamsburg's Vice President of Education, Research, and Historical Interpretation, says despite starting African American interpretation at Colonial Williamsburg more than 40 years ago, there's still a long way to go.
I think it's been a very slow boil, if you will, for us to be telling the story.
And they're working on it with projects such as archaeological digs like First Baptist and Custis Square.
I keep saying we're human, but we are. So sometimes we don't see things the way we should, or we overstep. And I think that's very typical of any group, of any leadership team. So the best thing to do is to constantly be having those conversations, checking in with our partners in the community and our partners with our staff and as well as other museums. And if we've made a misstep, we need to admit it and we need to then correct it.
Kelly says they're also working to include more programming in person and virtual to reach a broader audience. But one of their most successful paths is just talking with visitors.
So I think it's quite remarkable how quickly someone standing in an 18th century costume can get a total stranger to talk about issues that are relevant to us today in America. It is really amazing to see my colleagues, begin a conversation or begin a tour, and within 10 minutes they have a group of total strangers talking about race or talking about religion, talking about race and religion. In a way that it just can't be accomplished if we were all standing in the line at a large department store or something like that. It just breaks down a barrier. It provides an opportunity through the past for us to understand ourselves today.
She's optimistic that their work and relationships with the community can be an example for others around the country to help change hearts and minds.
My hope is that the conversations that we begin here in Williamsburg, which are very thoughtful in many, many, many cases. People are leaving really thinking about our constitutional democracy, really thinking about what was started here and what is unfinished and what is our job as the current, present society to take forward, to make sure that it is changed and fulfilled for next generations. So my hope is the conversation starts here.
That's a sentiment that First Baptist shares when it comes to telling their own story.
What I'm hoping to do is to be able to tell the whole story. A lot of our history has been buried in the soil of this country, been made invisible. So I'm hoping that when we tell this story, that people will get a glimpse that we have been part of this country, we have been part of the buildup of this country, and we ought to do a better job as far as race relations, as far as protecting our democracy. And I think that once people really know the history, I think then people will begin to have respect for one another and the contributions of a people. So I'm just hoping that this history at First Baptist Church can be told.
A history they're hoping to cement by rebuilding what once stood here to tell the story to future visitors as well as future members of their congregation.
I'm enjoying it because I can now tell my granddaughter and other children about this, because now I'm one of the older ones now, and I never really ever thought that would happen.
But it will, and moves our Commonwealth and country one step closer towards healing through understanding that can make conversations and stories started here be more relatable to all.
It's an American story, the resilience of this church, and now to be able to see that space where they were congregating from the very beginning, or almost from the very beginning, and to stand right at it. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than being in the space where history happened.